Okay, so yesterday or the day before on Friday, we finished the laws of tzara'as in the cycle of the Rambam study. And I want to talk a little bit about a specific halacha in the Rambam of tzara'as. And we touched upon it with Yimin Chamariv earlier in the week. Also being, there's a very fascinating and famous Gemara on this very halacha, which is Adjudicates. It's a Gemara which we say that the secrets of the Torah are hidden in the Adjudicates. So it's a Gemara, but it's perhaps not so typical Nigla Gemara. It's more esoteric. And finally, in Chassidus, there's been a lot written in Chassidus, both by the Alter Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, and the Rebbe, and the Mittler Rebbe, and explaining the mystical dimension to this halacha. So as we're in the season of Yutas Kislev and Chanukah and Light and Chassidus, so I thought it would be a nice idea to go through this halacha both from the Nigla perspective and from the Chassidus perspective and see how they complement each other. So the introduction that you need to know is everybody's familiar with the idea of tzara'as, which is a lesion, a white lesion that comes on the skin, and if it fits certain criteria, it renders the person it's tzara'as. It renders the person a mitzvah with all sorts of ramifications. He becomes tamei, and there's all the relevant halachas. He has to stay outside of the walled cities, etc., etc. Reuven, there is a real knife on the other table, which may save you some aggro. So that's the basic halacha. Now, one of the ways, if a person just has the white lesion, doesn't automatically make him tamei, then has to follow by a siman tuma. Now, a siman tuma can be one of three things. The one we're going to discuss today is white hairs. That means if a person has a lesion the size of a gris, whatever that size is, it's a nickel, a dime, a quarter, whatever. If this person has a white lesion that size, before I keep on using this word lesion, is that the accurate word? It's really just a discoloration. It doesn't have to be any growth or anything. It's just a discoloration of the skin. I'm not sure if lesion means stuff. All right, whatever it is. If a person has, we're just going to use the word baheres. That's the Hebrew word for it. All right. So if a person develops this discoloration, this baheres, and he also has two white hairs inside the baheres, then that is one of the qualifications, and this baheres is indeed a tzara'as. Now, in order for the white hairs to count, it has to be that first came the baheres, then came the white hairs. If a person has white hairs, that's, let's say, the natural color of his hair and his skin, and or even if that's not the natural color, but his hairs turned white, and then after the hairs turned white, then the skin became discolored, that does not qualify as tzara'as. It has to be, as the pasuk says, "V'hi hafcha seir lavan," the baheres turned the hair white. But if the white hair preceded the baheres, then it does not qualify as tzara'as. Okay, now there's a Mishnah. The Mishnah says as follows: if you have a baheres kechatzi gris, you have a baheres which is only the half the requisite size. It's the half of a half a gris, and as of yet there are no white hairs there. And then, so right now you see half a gris size discoloration, no problem, right? Then the next day the guy wakes up and he sees that first of all there's now become an additional half a gris, so in total we have a full gris, and there are two white hairs. So now it's a full-fledged tzara'as. That's the first half of this Mishnah. Then the Mishnah continues, and then the Mishnah explains that we have this principle that the baheres has to precede the white hair and not vice versa. Okay, and then the Mishnah continues, Vim safek, if there is a suffix, that means we observe discolored skin, we observe white hair, we just don't know, we weren't paying close enough attention, it happened in his sleep, whatever, we don't know what came first. Did the white hair come first, in which case it's not a tzara'as, or did the baheres come first, in which case it is tzara'as? So we have a machlokes. The Tana Kama of the Mishnah, the anonymous default Tana of the Mishnah says that it is impure. And then Rabbi Yeshua says keha, which I'm not going to get into the word keha right now, but basically keha means that he holds it is pure, it is tahir, it is not tzara'as. So again, if the baheres precedes the white hair, tami. If the white hair precedes the baheres, then it's tahir. If it's a doubt, then we have a machlokes between the Tana Kama and Rabbi Yeshua. Ad Kan is the Mishnah. Now, on this Mishnah, there is a famous Gemara. We just learned one of the many ways this Gemara is famous. First of all, it's famous because it's a very fascinating Gemara, fascinating story. But one of the ways why it's famous specifically in Chabad is because it's quoted. A line of it is quoted on the very first page of Tanya. We just learned it in the Chitas of Friday, which, by the way, was also this very same day with which we finished learning Hilchos tzara'as and Rambam. So it all comes together. That is that Raba never wasted a minute of Torah study. What's the source of that idea that Raba never wasted a minute of Torah study? So that comes from this story. We're not going to do the whole story; it's a long story, but we're just going to do the relevant part, which is basically that the Rabba Bar Nachmani they were on a hot chase. They were chasing him. The authorities, they wanted to kill him. They wanted to put him to death, and he was escaping. So he was hanging out at this pond. He had just escaped from the jail. He was hanging out at this pond, and as he's sitting there in the pond or near the pond learning Torah, and as this is going on down here in this world, there is something going on up there in the heavenly world, right? There is a machlokas happening in the heavenly yeshiva. Who's the Rosh Yeshiva of the heavenly yeshiva? Hashem. Okay. So the Rosh Yeshiva is having a machlokas with the students. Okay, so what's clear is clear. We know that if the Beheres comes first, it's Tameh. If the white hair comes first, it's Tahir. Suffolk. What's the thing of Suffolk? This very case that we just saw in the Mishnah, that the Tanakama says Tameh and the Rabbi Yeshua says Tahir. This is the very concept that God and the Masifta Derukia were debating on that fateful day when Rabba Bar Nachmani is sitting by the pond studying Torah on his escape from the government who wanted to put him to death. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Tahir. God says Tahir. It's pure. But the entire heavenly academy, they were at odds with God. They said, no, it is Tameh. Okay, so how are we going to adjudicate this machlokes? Man noichach, who's going to decide? Noichach Rabba Bar Nachmani. This Rabba Bar Nachmani, who's down there at the pond, he's the guy who can adjudicate. He's going to decide who's right, God or the Masifta Derukia. So we need to summon Rabba Bar Nachmani. So why is Rabba Bar Nachmani the one who could adjudicate? Because Rabba Bar Nachmani has said that Ani Yochid Ben Agoyim, Ani Yochid Ba'alis, I am unique. And as Rabbi Epstein likes to say, unique means the only one, singular, right? You can't. If you ever say very unique, watch out for Rabbi Epstein's wrath, because if it's unique, it's not very unique. It's either unique or it's not unique. So ani yachid, I am singular. I am unique. B'negoim. He was unique in his grasp of anything to do with the laws of negoim, of tzara'as. And b'meila, it's suitable for Rabbi Bar Nachmani to be. I can't believe he actually thinks the World Cup is more interesting than this. It's appropriate for Rabbi Bar Nachmani to be the one to adjudicate this machlekes. So we have to summon him. So who do they send? They send the Malach HaMavis. And the Malach HaMavis was not able to summon Rabbi Bar Nachmani because Rabbi Bar Nachmani was studying Torah. And he wouldn't stop, right? That's where the Alter Rebbe, that's the quote in Tanya, that Rabbi Bar Nachmani never stopped studying Torah. Even here, I mean, the Alter Rebbe doesn't spell that all out, but even here he's like running for his life. And even so, he is not stopping for a minute from Torah study. By the way, there's a nice parallel story of the Rebbe when he was escaping the Nazis and he was in Vichy, which you can all be seen on the various Gem interviews, etc. Not for right now. Anyway, so there was a guy who was going to arrange the visas to leave France, but the Rebbe said only if it could be done without Bittul Torah. Anyway, so basically, how are we going to get the Malach? How are we going to get Rabba? So the Malach HaMavis makes this. The wind makes a sound between the reeds, which made it sound as if the king's messengers were about to catch him. So quickly he has to stand up and escape because they're about to catch him. So as he stopped for that instance, he stopped learning Torah. The Malach HaMavis was able to grab him, and he took him to the next world. Ki havakonaycha nafshei. As Rabbi was dying, he said, "Tahir, Tahir." He ruled on this case. Tahir, Tahir. The tzara'as is pure. He ruled in accordance with Hakadosh Baruch Hu. That's Tahir. Okay. Then the Tabaskel came, and it said, "Ashecha, Rabbi Bar Nachmani, that you are pure, and your body is pure, and your soul is pure, and your soul left you with pure." Okay, very nice. Now, later on in the Gemara, it says that he didn't just say that it was pure. He actually found an allusion to this, not an illusion, an allusion to this, where the pasuk says that because it has the word tahir before the word tameh, so that indicates to us that if we're not sure, we err on the side of tahir. Okay, that's the end of the story. That's relevant to our sugya right here. So again, let's summarize. In the case of a doubt, what came first, the beheras or the white hair? We have machlokas in the Mishnah between the Tanakama who says it is no good and the Bishua says it is good. We have a parallel machlokas between God and the Masif to the Rakia, whatever that means, we'll see soon, that God says it is good and the Masif to the Rakia says it's not good. We call upon Raba Bar Nachmani to adjudicate, and he says that it is good like God and like Rabbi Yeshua. And so, if you were the Rambam, and you were writing the laws of tzara'as, what would you write? Would you write that it is pure, or would you write that it is impure?
Hashem says it's pure, then it's pure.
Hashem says it's pure, it's pure. Not only did Hashem say it's pure, we had to get Raba to adjudicate, and he also said it's pure, right? So you would do, so l'chayra, you would rule in accordance with God and Raba Bar Nachmani. I mean, if you're gonna, what's it called, hedge your bets, that's, okay. So, says the birthday boy that he would paskin like God. Okay? However, if you open the Rambam, Hilchos Tumas Tzara'as Perek Beis Halacha Tes, it's the final halacha in the chapter, in chapter 2, out of 15 chapters, I think. 16 chapters. So, the Rambam says, he quotes the Mishnah, Beheras Kachatzi Gris, you have a Beheras half a gris, and then next to the half a gris, so far we're nothing, and then next to it you have another Beheras of a half a gris, and in that half a gris is 2 white hairs, so then it becomes Tameh. However, Sufik Seir Lovin, if we don't know which one came first, so then says the Rambam, Harei Zu Tameh, it is impure. He rules like the Tanakama, he rules like the Masif to the Rakia against HaKadosh Baruch Hu, against Rabbi Nachmani, against Rabbi Yeshua. And then the Rambam adds 2 words. It appears to me that this is considered a doubtful tumah, a sufik tumah, which we're not going to get into those last words of the Rambam right now. Okay, so before we go into understanding why the Rambam paskins like against God, against Rabbi Nachmani's adjudication. There's a more fundamental question that has to be asked, and that is, in Torah there's always a concept of chazaka, which very loosely would translate as status quo. What that means is that we always assume the status quo. So just perhaps a typical example, some Ruvain, let's use a different name, Avram. No, it's also someone present. All right, let's go. Shmerel. Okay, there's no Shmerels around this table. Shmerel wants to divorce his wife. So his wife is on the other side of the world. He's in Chicago, and his wife is in, New York. So he sends a shliach. He writes again. There's something called a shliach. Yosef Gittin. There's something called a shliach. You write the get. He gives it to the shliach, and he says, "You're going to New York. I'm making you a shliach to deliver this get to my wife." And then, once it takes him, before the interstate highways, it takes him a week to get to New York. He gets to New York, he finds his wife, and he finds Shmerel's wife, and he delivers the get, and at the moment Shmerel's wife receives the get from the agent, from the delivery boy, who brought it from Chicago, she becomes divorced. Now the question is, before modern communication, you can only divorce a wife of a living husband. How do you know a week later when you're getting to New York that the husband, that Shmerel, is still alive? Maybe he died. And then the divorce would be invalid. Right? There could be all sorts of ramifications. We need to know, halachically, is this woman considered a widow or is she considered a divorcee? There's many, many ramifications to that. So the answer is chazaka. We assume status quo. If the husband was alive a week ago and he made you a shliach, we're going to assume, unless you know otherwise, we're going to assume he's still alive. That's called chazaka. Now this principle of chazaka, what? Sorry?
I think I just learned this. But isn't
it comes up in many areas, in many sugars of Shas. Chazaka, sometimes it makes more sense to us, sometimes it seems a little bit like...
In this case specifically, isn't there also a point that when he gives it, he's alive, and then technically the shliach is being transferred, and it doesn't matter even if he...
No, if we were to know that the husband died, the shliach would not be allowed to deliver the get.
If
Right.
he doesn't know.
If he doesn't know, we have a chazaka, which again, very loosely, I'm translating as status quo. It's not really an accurate translation, but let's just use it for now. Dan, can I trouble you for tissue, please? Now, then there's something called reyasa in the chazaka. If the chazaka, or the status quo, thank you, has been challenged. So if the status quo has been challenged, so now we're not going to rely on the chazaka. So in our case, where Shmerel is sending a get to New York, what happens if we hear that Shmerel was hit by a truck? Now, we don't know that he died. It's possible that he's still alive. But we can no longer just assume he's alive because we had a status quo. Because that status quo, that chazaka, was challenged. Okay. Now, let's try and import that model into tzara'as over here. We have here a doubt. We don't know whether or not this guy is a Metzia. We don't know. If the Beharas came first, he is a Metzia. If the white hair came first, he's not a Metzia. So l'chayra, why don't we just assume status quo? Status quo is that he was not a Metzia, so let's maintain that status quo. And in fact, the Rambam says so clearly later on in chapter 6 of Tumas tzara'as, the Rambam says very clearly that with the exception of the two cases that we mentioned, one of them being our case right here, in all other cases, if a person has a suffix tzara'as, he's considered Torah. He doesn't use the word chazaka, but that's what he says, and it's in Perek Vav Halacha He and Halacha Vav. If a person is already a Metzora and we're not sure whether the tzara'as has, quote, healed, then we assume him to still be a Metzora, because status quo. But if he is not yet confirmed a Metzora, and we have a case we're not sure whether or not he's a Metzora, status quo is that he remains Torah. So why don't we use that same concept of chazaka over here to say that if we don't know if the Beharas preceded the white hairs or the white hairs preceded the Beharas, we should keep him on his chazaka. So this is a question which the Rambam doesn't explicitly address, but many Rishonim address it. And I'll go through two answers. First of all, there's a Tosfos. Tosfos says here, this is not considered a chazaka. Why not? Because the chazaka has been challenged. The status quo has been challenged, just like we gave the mashal of Shmerel being hit by a truck. The chazaka has been challenged. How has the chazaka been challenged? What's your chazaka? Your chazaka is that this guy is not a Metzora. That chazaka has been challenged. Why? Because, Tosfos says, usually the nega makes the white hair tummy. In other words, this whole tzara'as thing is a supernatural phenomena, which, by the way, there is some discussion. The Rambam says at the very end of tzara'as, what he says explicitly is that tzara'as on clothing and tzara'as on houses are supernatural. He doesn't explicitly say, at least in Mishnah Torah, that tzara'as on this flesh, on skin, is a supernatural phenomena. If I recall correctly, there is some indication about the Rambam's opinion on that in his commentary to the Mishnah. Not for now, but just to mention that. Okay, so basically, Tosfos says usually tzara'as is tzara'as. So usually, if there's a beharas, and there's white hair, we're going to assume that the beharas came first. So in other words, Tosfos is saying you've ruined your chazaka. Now, so says the Tosfos Yom Tov, I don't understand. Mainly, you're talking about a person with of dark complexion who's young, so his hair is not white anyway. So then you could make the assumption of Tosfos that if he has white hairs and he has a beharas, he's ruined his chazaka, and therefore we assume him to be tamei. But that wouldn't be true, he says, of an older person whose hairs are naturally white. And it also wouldn't be true, he says, of a German person whose skin is naturally a lighter color and his hair is also naturally a lighter color. And he says, you look at the Mishnah, it says that any case of suffix, we have this very same discussion. It doesn't matter if he's young or old, it doesn't matter if he's Ethiopian, which just means dark complexion, or he's German. Right? That's Yom Tov's word. Ben Kushi, Ben Germani. So therefore, Yom Tov doesn't like this answer of Tosfos, and he comes up with another answer. He quotes this answer, and the Tosfos Yom Tov himself doesn't like it, but in the Mishnah it fits very nicely, and this suggestion is made by the Ma'aser Keach to be pshat in the Rambam. He says, if you look carefully, I read to you the Rambam from Perek Beis Halacha Tes. However, if you look earlier on in that same Perek, 3 halachas earlier, it says the white hair, the basic principle that we're all basing this whole discussion on, the basic principle that the white hair is only a siman tumah if it if it follows the Beheres, but if it precedes the Beheres, so then it's not a Siman Tumah. Now, when the Rambam said that, he didn't mention anything about a case of doubt. Only 3 halachas later, where we mentioned this unusual case where you start off with a half a gris, and the half a gris is nothing. But then afterwards you have an additional half a gris next to it, which with 2 hairs. In that case, the Rambam says that in a doubt, you're machmir. Says the Ma'aser Keach and other Rishonim learn this pshat in the Mishnah that this is not just a fluke. This is by design. If it's quote a regular case where we observe a beheres, we observe white hairs, and we have no idea what came first, so then you would assume him to not be tzara'as. Why? Because you indeed have a chazaka, the status quo. But here we're talking about a case where we know for sure there was already a beheres of a half a gris. So even though beheres of a half a gris is not good enough, is not beheres enough, it's not to qualify as tzara'as, but it's at least beheres enough to challenge the status quo. Like in the mashal of the guy being hit by a truck, we don't know for sure he's dead, but at least the status quo has been put to challenge.
So what do you?
So here we're saying what we're suggesting over here is that the Rambam only holds that the Rambam is only saying, and again the Rambam would learn this pshat in the Mishnah also, that the suffix where we're saying that you're tamei is only if you know for sure you had a half a beheres before the white hairs. Then you have half a beheres before the white hairs. That's called a challenge to the chazaka, a challenge to the status quo, and we're going to assume that the second half of the beheres also preceded the white hairs, and we're going to make him tamei. But if it's a straight out doubt, we have no idea what came first, we would rely on the chazaka. That's one interpretation of the Rambam.
So, Rabbi.
Yes.
Can't you just wait and see if it goes larger, then you know for sure?
There are cases where you have to wait to see if it gets larger, but here the Rambam doesn't say that. He doesn't say to wait to see if you get larger. He says it's tummy.
I know, but a practical thing is, if you see that it's going to get bigger, then you know for sure.
Well, thank God, tzara'as is not practical. So we don't need to talk practical. This is just like we mentioned last week. We study Torah to study Torah, not for practical.
Okay. Tosas Yom Tov was before the Rambam or after?
Tosas Yom Tov is much after the Rambam. Tosas Yom Tov is the last. I don't know. I'm gonna publicize my ignorance over here, but in a few hundred years ago, the Tosas Yom Tov, if I don't remember exactly, if I don't even think he mentions the Rambam. He's talking about the Mishnah. But the Ma'aser Keach, he says his prat in the Rambam, and then he says that he found the Tosas Yom Tov similar. No, maybe not. I don't know. Whatever the case is, this pshat is a little bit more difficult to interpret in the Mishnah than it is in the Rambam. Whatever the case is, that's a pshat in the Rambam. Now let's go back to our original question of, okay, so we understand why the principle of chazaka doesn't challenge the Rambam's ruling, because the chazaka has been challenged. But what about this whole story which you said before? Why is the Rambam paskening against God? Why is he paskening against Rabba Bar Nachmani's adjudication? So, on a very basic level, the Kesef Mishnah says, I'm sorry, what God says is irrelevant, because, as we know the principle, we had a number of classes on this in the past, about prophecy and dreams. Torah loy b'shamayim. Torah is not, the only thing that matters is the way it's understood down here in this world, by the Bezdin, by the majority of the Bezdin, of the Sanhedrin, and so what God says is irrelevant. Rabba Bar Nachmani is down here on earth. No, Rabba Bar Nachmani is also irrelevant because he said it as his soul was departing. That is also basically considered as if he said it in the next world, and it is irrelevant. Okay, that's basically the summary of the halacha side of this conversation, at least the main primary points. And now I'll take a question or two. I would like to move on to what Chassidus has to say, and I'm going to be basing this on a discussion of the Alter Rebbe in the Torah Parshas Tazria, on a maimer of the Tzemach Tzedek in Derech Mitzvah and the laws of tzara'as, and also in a sicha from our Rebbe in the Sichas Chelik Yud Beis on Parshas Tazria, and perhaps in another sicha also in Chelik Gimel on Lag BaOmer. So just to make sure the sources are out there. Yes, Yosef. No, I thought you said one else. Okay, so I'm going to ask 3 questions, and hopefully address these 3 questions from the perspective of Chassidus. 3 questions are, and I believe this was Bill's question to start out with, what does it even mean that the Masifta to the Rukiah dispute God? What's that supposed to mean? right? I mean, ostensibly, the idea of studying Torah is the Word of God. You're trying to understand the Word of God. So, it's like the joke of the Brisker, the Brisker Talmidim, who they're very passionate about studying Rambam and fine tuning exactly what the Rambam means, and they can't make up their mind. And they come into the next world and they say, there's different versions of the joke, but basically they introduce and go ask the man himself. He asks the Rambam himself, and the Rambam says, "Oh no, you got it completely wrong. This is just a typo. That's not what I said." And the Brisker looks at him and he goes, "Was versteht der Frank in der Rambam," which is a racist joke about the intellectual qualities of Sephardim. But the point is that ostensibly you're studying Torah to understand the Word of God. Well, God is telling you what He means. What does this mean that the Mesivta D'Rakia are arguing on God? Number two. Once we figure out what it means that there's a machlokas between God and Mesivta D'Rakia, well, who's Raba Bar Nachmani? Well, why does he get to adjudicate this? Mm-hmm. And finally, once we understand what God means, what Mesivta D'Rakia means, and what Raba Bar Nachmani means, then we have to ask the question, which we tried to address a little bit from a Nigla perspective, but from the Chassidus perspective, who we're going to paskin like. Okay, so Memali Kol Almin and Soiviv Kol Almin. I'm sure everybody has at least heard those terms. If you've studied any Tanya or Chassidus, you've certainly heard them. Very briefly, we talk about God, the way God is in a quote-unquote real relationship with this world. Obviously, God as the creator and the controller, but the world is part of the picture. And then Soiviv Kol Almin, the way God is, let's use the word beyond worlds. For a very perhaps simplistic mashal, you have the kid who, for him, whether or not he gets this the lollipop from the candy man is the make it and break it for his whole day, and then you have the adult who's candy. It's like it's sugar. It doesn't even taste good. It tastes artificial. A geshmaka steak, in a short rib with on sous vide on the grill, and that's geshmak, right? So from the adult's perspective, who's a food connoisseur, the candy is completely insignificant. But from the kid's perspective, the candy is everything. So you might say the same thing. From our perspective, we think, "Oh wow, the world. This is the real deal." And if I don't have enough money to pay the bills, that really affects me. And if I'm having a good day, that also really affects me. And then you have God, who the whole thing. He doesn't. If it's good, it doesn't. It's not meaningful to him. Again, meaningful is the wrong word. It's not significant to him. If it's bad, it's not significant to him. The whole thing is like, oh, did I get a yellow candy or a red candy? What's the difference? I mean, I don't mean red. Of course, red is better, but I'm just saying. Okay, yellow or green. Pineapple or apple, whatever. Okay.
I think blue is the favorite color around here.
All right. So, if we're I think it's the mystery color is the favorite.
Mystery color.
The mystery. All right.
That's the blue one.
So, we have here the Mesivta D'Rakia and God talking about tzara'as. So, tzara'as, in general, impurity. What does impurity mean? It means that I feel myself as being my own entity, separate from God. That's why, how do you counter tumah? You go to the mikveh, you do tevila, which is the same letters as the word bittul, right? So, impurity, tumah, tzara'as, is the opposite of bittul, of alignment with God, right? So, kedusha, holiness, purity, that's one side, in being aligned with God. And Tumah, tzara'as, is the opposite of that. Now, so the Mesivta D'Rakia, the heavenly yeshiva, they are operating on a Memali Kol Almin, from a Memali Kol Almin perspective, right? They are studying Torah. Obviously, they're not studying Torah the same way we do in this world, but they're studying Torah in yeshiva style. In other words, it's mirroring the way we study Torah in this world. So they're approaching it from a quote worldly perspective. From a worldly perspective, what we have here is a suffix tumah, a suffix. Perhaps this person is already overstepped the boundary. He's no longer in alignment with God. And so this is true of any suffix. Anytime we have a doubt about a biblical law, we always go on the side of caution, suffix l'chumra. So too here, if this person may be out of line, he may have too much of his own ego starting to build up. So suffix is going to be tummy. Because as soon as you're a little bit out of line, you're already a threat. You're talking about bittul or not bittul, right? Are you your own identity, or are you subsumed and aligned within God's identity? Well, it's like the kid. The kid could misbehave in class, but before he misbehaves in class, he's already behaving in a way where the kid is like, okay, the teacher might think, okay, I better put this kid in place. If I don't, I can see where this is headed. So that's if you have a regular teacher who's doing his class discipline, right? So that's why the Masifta Derakia, they say this is no good. But God, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is a perspective of Soivav Kalalmin. That means Kadosh means removed, right? So it's Soivav, it's the higher perspective. Over there, a little bit of Yeshus is not really a threat. In other words, the world is so insignificant that so long. If you have an explicit threat, if the kid is actually, imagine you have a teacher who doesn't need to discipline. He's such a good teacher, and he's so talented in teaching and maintaining his calm and his cool and all that stuff. The kid fidgeting in the back is not going to disturb him, right? So, from the perspective of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from Soivav Kol Almin, over there we're going to say that a little bit of Yeshus doesn't affect, and that's why from HaKadosh Baruch Hu's perspective, we're going to say it is pure. So this, sort of to answer the first question, what does it mean that the Masifta Derakia are arguing with God? It's not really that they're arguing. Masifta Derakia and God and HaKadosh Baruch Hu are expressing two different perspectives. We have the perspective of Mamali Kol Almin, where this small infringement already poses a threat, and we have the perspective of Soivav Kol Almin of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, where such a minute infringement doesn't pose a threat.
In other words, it could be a big deal to us, but not to Kodesh.
Exactly. Very good.
Okay.
I'm going to say this very same point with a little bit more depth in Chassidic terminology, and bear with me. But if you don't bear with me, you'll get back onto the train in a couple moments. Originally, there's only God, right? So everything is Kedusha, everything is holiness. How do we even get to a reality where we have things that attempt or seek to negate God? So we know there's this idea called Shviras HaKelim. You have the world of Tohu, and then the chaos. It's too intense, and everything. The chaos just destroys everything. And from that we have the Yeridus and Etzotzos until you come to the Klippos, the forces of impurity, we call them, are able to survive by latching onto these sparks that, quote, fall down from the Shviras HaKelim. Now, in Kabbalah, it explains that the point where Shviras HaKelim starts is from Das and down. Why from Das and down? Because Shviras HaKelim is an emotional. The chaos is an emotional response, right? It's too intense. The guy has a nervous breakdown. That's Shviras HaKelim. It's an emotional thing. It's not an intellectual thing. People who have, unfortunately, sometimes the guys who have these nervous breakdowns, they're the smartest guys. Intellectually, they're amazing. It's on an emotional level that the emotions can't contain that type of intensity. So Das is really where emotions start. Das is that point of transfer where you're taking this intellectual idea and translating it and developing it into an emotional reaction, feeling toward it. So, therefore, what we're saying is that from the perspective of Mamali Kol Almin, what we have to pass in the halacha, the yeshiva, the Masifta Derakia, we pass in the halacha according to what we understand. That means we're already within the realm of das, of understanding. What's within, of what we can relate to, right? Midas also, that's the things, you can have an emotional relationship with something you relate to. If it's completely beyond you, you can't really have a real relationship with it. So from within that perspective, we're already within the realm where Shviras HaKelim has an impact, where the forces of impurity have nourishment to exist, and therefore we have to reckon with it as a force. And therefore, as soon as there's a suffix, we say this is no good. Whereas HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which we said before was Soivav Kol Almin, which is higher than Das, over there's no Shviras HaKelim. I'm beyond the threat of Shviras HaKelim, of this turning into chaotic reality that allows for klippas to exist. And therefore, from the perspective of God, it doesn't pose a threat. Again, that's just a little bit taken from the Maimar of the Samach Tzedek and a little bit from the Kutei Torah also. That's sort of a little bit more language and to explain what this means. Okay, so to summarize, we've answered question one. Question one was, what does it mean that Masifta Durakia argue with God? The answer is that Masifta Durakia and God are just two perspectives within different, what we call different levels of Alikus. Yeah, from the perspective of a Malik Alalmin, this suffix already poses a threat, and therefore they say it's Tameh. From the perspective of Sevav Kalalmin, it does not pose a threat, and therefore it is not. It does not. It is tar. Okay. Now, then we say, okay, we have this machlikus. Who's going to be machriya? Who's going to adjudicate? Who's going to decide? Raba bar Nachmani. And remember, we said Raba bar Nachmani. Why does he get to paskin? Because the Gemara said he is yachid b'negoim. He is unique in negoim. Now, that word yachid is really important because there is echad and there is yachid. Hashem Elokeinu Hashem echad. God is one. And yachid means singular. What is the difference between one and singular?
One indicates more.
One indicates either that there is or that at least there's a possibility for two. Singular or singular. There's nothing else happening, right? So even though we say that until now we've been saying HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Seivah Kol Almin, he's at this. That's the perspective of where the worlds are completely insignificant. At the end of the day, it's not completely insignificant. It's insignificant, but it's Soiviv Kalalmin. The worlds are insignificant, but you're already talking about some relationship to the world. The higher level of God, which is represented by Raba bar Nachmani, who is not Echad, but Yachid, singular, right? That's the perspective where there is no threat at all from the Olamas. And you might say this is using our mashal of the kid who wants to know if he's going to get a yellow or green candy versus the adult who's the food connoisseur of the country, right? Okay, but at the end of the day, they're worlds apart, but at the end of the day, they're both talking the same language. They're both about what makes your palate feel the best, right? Okay, so you have a much more sophisticated palate than the kid. But then you have a person who taste of food, that's nothing. You know what's really geschmack, what's really pleasurable? Doing a favor, helping another yid. Right now, that's already a completely different. You're not talking about a lollipop versus steak. You're talking about materialistic, lowly indulgence versus a higher type of pleasure that a person can have. A pleasure from doing a mitzvah, a pleasure from doing a favor for another yid. So that's where food is completely insignificant. You're going to tempt him with a steak, he doesn't know what you're talking about, right? Now, there is a concept in halacha called halacha k'divrei hamachriya, which Chassidus uses this. Actually, the way Chassidus uses it is not exactly what it means in halacha, but for the purposes of our clock, which we're watching, we're going to explain it from the way Chassidus explains it now. Halacha k'divrei hamachriya means, according to this interpretation, that you have a machlikus. You say A, you say B. So there's a concept of machriya. Machriya is somebody. So on a literal level, you might say it's somebody who's the middle ground. The middle ground. Okay, we're going to pass like a middle ground. Says Chassidus, no. Machriya doesn't mean the middle ground. Machriya means somebody who is beyond these two perspectives, and from a place of being beyond those two perspectives, is able to say something which is correct according to both of them. Right? Not, I'm going to compromise. I'll take a little bit of what you say and a little bit of what you say and make a compromise. Compromise, says Chassidus, that's not what machriya means. Machriya means I'm able to uplift myself to a much higher perspective where I can take the point where both of you agree fully. Compromise is I take 50% of you, 50% of you. Says Chassidus, machriya is a place where I can take 100% of both of you and bring it. And really, this is, in modern psychology and understanding, this is whenever there's a machlokes between two people in therapy, whatever it is, often the solution is can we lift these people up to a place where there could be an option that works for both of them. Now, it's not just about technicality. You want to go vacation to Japan, you want to go vacation to Hawaii. Okay, I'm going to convince you guys. But you go to Bahamas, you both like it. Fine. It takes maturity to be able to say to lift yourself up. I'm trapped. No, this is what I want. This is what I want. Right? A certain level of maturity of lifting yourself beyond that, you're able to see how actually there is another option here which you were not able to see earlier. I'll give an example which is brought in the Sikha. I just think it's might be I think it's quite relatable. You have chesed, gevura, tiferes. Chesed is kindness. I'm just going to give the guy, just give and give and give. Gevura says, no, you don't just give and give and give. Does he deserve it? Does he not deserve it? You only give people what they deserve. So that's chesed, that's gevura. What's the machriya? The machriya is tiferes, rachamim. Rachamim comes along and says, look, Mr. Chesed, Rachamim is not saying, okay, you're saying I should give him 1,000, you're saying I should give him nothing, okay, I'll give him 500. That's not machriya. Tiferes comes along and says, have rachmanis, have compassion. Don't be just kind to the guy, be merciful to him. What does that mean? You, Gevura, are saying give him nothing because he doesn't deserve anything. Your Chesed is saying give him, it doesn't matter whether or not he deserves. Comes Tiferes and says, look, you're talking from the perspective of the recipient. He doesn't deserve it. You're talking from the perspective of the giver. I'm a giver type of guy. I'm just going to give and give. Says Tiferes, let's look at this from a different perspective. Give him, but not because he deserves it, right? In other words, Chesed, you're not saying give him because he deserves it. I agree with you that he doesn't deserve it. But can we come to a place of being compassionate and merciful to him, where we're able to give him not just because you want to give endlessly, you without even a thought about whether or not he deserves it. We're going to think about him, and we're going to recognize that maybe he indeed does not deserve it. And at the same time, we can still be compassionate and give it to him from a place of rachmanus, not from a place of chesed, and not withholding from a place of gevura, but that type of tiferes which is able to lift it up higher. So back to our story with tzara'as and Raba bar Nachmani. God is saying, and Yosef the Rakia, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yosef the Rakia, Soivev Kol Almin and Mamalik Kol Almin. We're at odds with each other. Mamalik Kol Almin sees this as a threat. Soivev Kol Almin doesn't see it as a threat. Raba is Yochid. He's even higher than Soivev Kol Almin, where again he's the guy who doesn't care about steak or about candies. He just cares about real things, right? And he is able to make this impression on even on Mamalik Almin, he's able to make this impression on Masifta Darakia, where they might not be able. They're staying at Mamalik Almin. They're not going to recognize that he's on this really, really sublime level. They're not going to recognize what that is. They're not going to be able to adopt the perspective of Raba. But Raba, from his place of Yachid, he is able to impress upon them that this is the reality. Yes, you don't understand it. Yes, you don't relate to it, but you recognize my greatness, not my greatness. You recognize that there is this idea where Mamalik Almin is irrelevant and Soivev Kol Almin is irrelevant. It's just God Himself, and from that you're able to recognize that is something that I can. Sometimes the guy's such a genius. You could hear the guy speak. He's such a genius. I didn't understand the word he said, but I understood that there was true genius in it. So when you're able to have that, then you're able to impact that. Even Mamalik Almin can agree, you know what, it's tahir. Fine, I don't really understand why, but Raba bar Nachmani, from such a high perspective, was able to show me that such a perspective exists. And such a perspective is much more real and true than me. And even me, who likes to go to Charlotte's and really get a good piece of steak, I can recognize that the guy to whom this is meaningless and he gets his fulfillment in life out of doing mitzvahs, that's the real deal. I don't feel that way, but I can recognize that that's real, right? And that's why it says the Rebbe, if you look in the Gemara, Raba bar Nachmani doesn't say the same thing as God. God said Tahir, Raba bar Nachmani said Tahir. It was a double Tahir. Because the Tahir of Raba bar Nachmani is a much more sublime Tahir than the perspective of Soivev Kol Almin of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it's specifically that Tahir, that level, that can influence even Mamalik Almin, even Masifta Darakia. And
part I don't get. How is Tahir more better than
the fact that it's
Soivev Kol Almin?
No, which part? Say which part are you?
How is Raba?
Tahir represent. Rabba is Yochid. Rabba is that level that's higher than Soivev Kol Almin, and that is alluded to in the fact that Soivev HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is Soivev Kol Almin, just as regular Tahir, and Raba bar Nachmani has a double lashon of Tahir to demonstrate that this is not. It's not that we're saying the same. Yes, at the end of the day, we're both saying Tahir, but Raba bar Nachmani is saying it from a perspective where there is no possibility of Tumah.
You can't be
What would
higher
you call
than
that level in Chassidus?
Yachid, Atzmos. And by the way, not only is Rambam Nachmani able to, he's even able to show them that there's a pasuk in Torah. Remember, he had the pasuk in Torah that it says l'tahari before l'tamei, to demonstrate that if there's a case of doubt, l'tahari takes precedent to make it pure. They couldn't find the pasuk in the Chumash themselves. No, Rabbi Bar Nachmani was able to show them this, and once he showed it to them, he was able to show them that look, really, there's at least an allusion to this staring at you in the face. There's a similar concept which comes up in the Gemara a number of times, where you have that that they asked Rav Kano or Rav a question on his ruling. Shosek Rav, he didn't have what to answer, he couldn't respond to the challenge, but nevertheless the halacha remains like that. So Chassidus always invokes that story to demonstrate that you have sometimes an idea what Shosek Rav, I can't really articulate. I don't have the intellectual capacity, intellectual grasp, and language to communicate and to demonstrate why this is the case. But I have this hanacha. I have this deep-rooted recognition that is the case. Right? That's like me, who I like steak, but I could really recognize that the real truth is alikus. That's what really, with the guy who enjoys doing mitzvahs, that's what's really meaningful. So that's kind of what's happening here with the Masif Tekir and Rabbi Bar Nachmani, where on the one hand they can't really relate to his perspective, but on the other hand, it's Rabbi Bar Nachmani's influence on them is so powerful, they're so strong that they're able to recognize that in fact is the case. One second. So that's the second question. Second question I asked was, what does it mean that Rabbi Bar Nachmani is the one to adjudicate? So we have a Malik Kalaman, Sev Kalaman, and let's call it Yachid, Atzmus, which is not just supersedes both of them, but like we said before, Achra is not about superseding, it's not about compromise, it's tafka, it's that from the place of Achra, from the place of Yachid, you're able to impact and influence even the perspective of the Malik Kalaman. Okay? Now the question is, okay, that's all nice, and the Mamali and so everything, but how are we supposed to paskin? So we already discussed from the Nikla perspective how we're supposed to paskin. We spoke about it before, and the Kasef Mishnah invoked Torah Leibashamayimhi. But now we're going to do the Chassidus Pshat in the Rambam. So the Alter Rebbe in his Maimer in Likutei Torah specifically says this question. He in the Maimer he quotes the Rambam that we started with over here in Tumas tzara'as, and he says, what's going on? Why does Rambam paskin this way? And we have the Rash Mishantz, which is one of the Rishonim, one of the Balei HaTosfos, also a commentary on the Mishnah, and he implies that, not like the Rambam, he implies that he paskins Torah. So, what the Alter Rebbe says like this: the Rambam's perspective is, this is all good, I get it, but at the end of the day, like the Kesef Mishnah says, Torah loy b'shamayim, not because I'm negating the value of everything we've said until now, but at the end of the day, if I just because it's you influence me, okay, you influence me, but I have to paskin, I'm down here in this world, I have to paskin halacha, I have to paskin it the way I understand it. And I'll remember that quotes the Gemara in Eruvin, which says, it's an Eruvin Daf Yud Gimel Amud Beis, that Golav Yodua Lefnei Misha Amar V'Hoya Ha'olam She'im B'Deirish Sharamei K'moisei Aminei Mali Kavu Halacha K'moisei Shlo Yokel Chaveri of Lamid Al Seif Ta'itoi Shehu Omer Al Tomei Toher V'Mar Al Panim V'Al Toher Tomei V'Mar Al Panim. Right? What does that mean? God knows that Rameir is unique. There's no one like Rameir. There's no one like Rameir in his brilliance. But nevertheless, we don't paskin like Rameir. Right? By the way, it doesn't mean that we never paskin like Rameir. It just means that we don't fix that the halacha should always follow like Rameir. Now, why not? If Rameir is the most brilliant guy, and God even knows that he's unique, so why are we not always passing like Rameir? The answer is because Rameir, the Chachamim, they couldn't understand, they couldn't grasp, they couldn't really grasp what he was saying, right? And the example the Gemara gives is that whatever you said it was Tameh, he was able to be barely upon him to demonstrate that it should be Tahir. You say it's Tahir, he would be able to demonstrate that really it should be Tameh. His mastery over everything in Torah would, he could do this sleight of hand on you, and whatever you say, he'll bring you proofs the opposite. So that's brilliance, but it doesn't work when it comes to paskining, because in paskining, if I don't know if you're actually saying what you mean, or you're just doing some sleight of hand and just trying to trick me not trick me for the sake of tricking me for the sake of sharpening my skills of Torah study, fine, but at the end of the day, that's not a recipe for good Pesach halacha. So therefore, because he was too brilliant for me, that was detrimental to him, that we can't paskin like him. Says the Alter Rebbe, maroli panim, it means I'm able to take something that's so sublime and make it and bring it down to you, like sort of the pnimius, taking the pnimius of something, the sublime, the way it is from the perspective of Yachid, of Soiv Kol Almin, and bring it down to you. But if I can't really grasp it fully, I can't paskin like that. Says the Alter Rebbe, that's exactly what the Rambam is doing over here. The Rambam, you tell me God paskins like this, you tell me Rabbi Bar Nachmani paskins like this. It's like Rabbi Meir. It's amazing. It's super brilliant. It's super intense. It's amazing. But I can't paskin like this. I can only paskin the way I see it, and therefore, from the way I see it, that's the perspective of Mamalik al Almin. That's the perspective of Masifti the Rakia, and therefore, it's nice that in the next world, Masifti the Rakia may have agreed to be adjudicated by Rabbi Bar Nachmani, but in this world, I have to maintain the perspective of Masift of the Yeshiva, which paskins Tomei, and therefore I paskin like the Tanakama that it's Tomei. However, the Rash, he paskins, or at least implies that the Psak is like HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, why does he do so? So the Alter Rebbe says two words. I'm not sure exactly what he means, but I'll suggest. He says that it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, early in the Maimah, the Alter Rebbe talks about how HaKadosh Baruch Hu kind of bridges this gap between Soivev and Mamali, because Kadosh is Soivev Kol Amin, it's sublime, but Baruch means that it's drawn down. So perhaps, if I recall correctly, in the Lashon Alter Rebbe, I'll look it up right here. I think he says that if it were just to be Rabbi Bar Nachmani, yeah, Rabbi Bar Nachmani is super sublime. There's no way I could paskin like Rabbi Bar Nachmani in this world. But because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is also on his team, it's the opposite of the way it is in Nigla. In Nigla, what God says is irrelevant to halacha l'maisa because Torah is not in the next world. But what Rabbi Bar Nachmani says should be relevant. So we say no. The Chassid Mishnah says because he said it as he was passing, so it's also like Torah le'bashamayim. Here we're saying forget. If it would just be Rabbi Bar Nachmani, that would be so sublime. Of course, the Rash would agree that I don't pay any attention to it. But because it's also God, it's also HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu, again, I believe this is what Alter Rebbe means to say over here. Because it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that kind of in some way bridges this gap that there is between Soiv and Mamali. Therefore, the Rash Bashan says we can't paskin like HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he says Tahir that it is pure. Now, I just want to add one more thing over here. There is, I mentioned to you before, the Gemara says that God knows how great Reb Meir is, and the Chachamim know how great Reb Meir is. Lo yachol chaveirav lamid al seif da'ati. So his colleagues also recognize how great he was, but because he was too great for them, they couldn't paskin like him. That's what the Gemara says in Erevin. Now, there is another Gemara, it's a Yerushalmi, in the beginning of Sanhedrin, Perek Aleph Halacha Beis, where it talks about the process of Rebbe Kiva giving semicha to his students, and Reb Meir was given priority over Reb Shimon, which is Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. So Reb Shimon niskar kumupanav Pnei Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon was disheartened. Like he why was Reb Meir being treated better than him? He knew that he was a bigger Torah scholar than Reb Meir, so he felt like, is my Torah? He felt challenged. So Rabbi Kiva says to him, it's enough that me and your Creator recognize your talent, recognize your strength. So, in a Sikha of Lag Ba'omer, which is in L'Kutei Sichos Chelik Gimel, the Rebbe explains this al pi Chassidus. What this means is that Reb Meir, he was so great, like we saw before, but at least he was so great that his colleagues were able to recognize it. And that's like the mashal I gave before, where you hear the lecture of this guy who's such a genius, you could tell that he's such a genius. You don't understand the word he says, but you're just like in awe of how smart he is. But Reb Shimon ben Yochai, his genius is so sublime, that nobody recognizes it. God recognizes it, and his teacher Rabbi Kiva recognizes it, but other people don't recognize how brilliant he is. He's able to somehow deliver that brilliance without people catching on of how brilliant he actually is. So the Rebbe talks about that, about the level of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai being even higher than the level of Rabbi Meir. But I was thinking, the Gemara says, Gemara says in Erevin, and later on in Erevin Daf Mem Vav, we have this whole list of when we have a machlokes between this person and that person, who do we paskin? And there's rules. You have Rabbi Meir, we paskin like Rabbi Meir. Reb Meir Reb Shimon Mai. When you have a machlokes Reb Meir and Reb Shimon, what's the halacha? Who do we paskin like? Reb Meir Reb Shimon, and the Gemara says,
Shimon.
Come on, you learned Erevin, you don't remember. Just kidding. The Gemara says Teiku. We don't know.
I didn't learn Erevin.
You didn't start Daf Yomi before Erevin? Yes, you did. You started from Sachin? Where did you start Daf Yomi from?
Yeah, I started from Sachin.
All right, so you learn it in 5 years' time. Okay, so when you get to Erevim and Bava Metzia, you'll be just a few daf before making your Siyam HaShas. You'll remember this class.
Oh, man.
So I just saw online a video of there's this kollel called Shas Yidden, where there's guys who learn the entire Shas every year, and then they have this big test where they have all these Talmud Chacham come and testing them on Shas, and you have it must be about 50 guys over there. Each one has a mic, and they ask these questions, and these guys are screaming. You can't hear anything; they're screaming all the answers at the same time into the mic. Anyway, so.
Sounds like pretty
So where in Shas does it ram, and the guys are like rattling off a toasters over here. Anyway, so it's a shem. One of the Gemara says when we have machlokes Rameir and Shimon, how do you pass when the Gemara says teiko? So I was thinking that perhaps this is mirroring this same conflict that we have, which Alter Rebbe is discussing over here. The Rambam paskins like the Tanakama, and the Rash paskins like Hakadosh Baruch Hu. The Rambam is saying it's too sublime. Rameir, you are too sublime. I don't get it. I can't paskin like you. So I have to paskin like Reb Shimon, even though Reb Shimon might even be more sublime. But I don't recognize
Shimon
it.
wasn't involved in that situation.
I know, but I'm not saying Rameir and Reb Shimon. Rameir also wasn't involved in it. I'm saying the concepts over here that you have one type of sublime that's so sublime, and therefore you can't paskin like it. On the other hand, you have something that's so sublime I don't even recognize that it's sublime. That's Reb Shimon. So perhaps there's this challenge where this din of tzara'as, is it so sublime and therefore I can't paskin like it? Like Rameir is so sublime and I can't paskin like him, and that's the Rambam's perspective. Or you have the perspective of the Rash where he says, yes, it's so sublime, but I don't recognize that it's so sublime. To me, it's like Reb Shimon, and therefore I can't paskin like it. Okay, that's just an idea that I had at the end, sort of to tie it all together. Either take it or leave it. Anyway, thank you for joining me, and we celebrate the Siyam learning of tzara'as, which is Hilchos L'Mashiach, not even Hilchos L'Mashiach, because when Mashiach comes, there won't be any tzara'as. And Alichting in Chanukah to everybody. There are many Chanukah review classes from the Sunday morning series online, so I figured we did not have to do it again this year. And Chanukah to everyone.